Is anybody in the audience actually Danish? Are you really? All right, if you happen to know, because I'm ignorant of the correct pronunciation of my artist's last name, can you tell me? Okay, I forgot to ask my Swedish husband before I left the house. He actually would know, so I'm probably going to mispronounce it the entire time. But I promise eventually I will find out, and then I will correct my pronunciation. We're just waiting a little bit because there had been issues with parking, I know. But I guess I'll get started, and if people keep on opening the door, we'll just live with it. So my name's Eik Kahng, and I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and I also manage this lecture series called Art Matters. So I think most of you have probably been here before for the series, and typically I introduce my speaker, and I'm actually the speaker tonight by accident, largely. I have to tell you because one of my dear colleagues was supposed to be here named Suzanne Weaver, and she was going to give a very irreverent and amusing lecture on her experiences in contemporary art as a curator. And she unfortunately became ill and was unable to travel. So I decided to fill in. So you're getting the second-rate speaker, unfortunately. I am an academic by training, although I haven't given a public lecture in quite some time. So I'm a little worried that I'm gonna go over, so you let me know if I'm droning on too much, and I will try and silence myself. I will tell you just a little bit about myself as an art historian. I'm actually trained as a specialist of 1750 to 1850 French painting. That's how we used to train. But as a curator, I've curated pretty much everything across the gamut from old master to a little bit of contemporary. But my natural area is 19th century French painting, and I'm going to be talking to you about a Danish modernist whose name is Wilhelm Hammershøi. And I've called this lecture The Interior Sublime, and hopefully you'll see why very quickly. Okay, so there's our guy. And so today I want to introduce you, or at least some of you, to an artist named Wilhelm Hammershøi, again, probably mispronouncing his last name. And, you know, here he is. He was Danish. He was born in Copenhagen on May 15th, 1864, and his career as a mature exhibiting artist spanned roughly 30 years. Now, I'm not going to get into this, but you know Danish painting, right? How many people know a lot about the history of Danish painting? Well, let's all admit that with rare exception, Bob Marshall raised his hand, with rare exception, most people don't know much about Danish art history. And, you know, there are lots of good reasons for that historically, and it has to do with canon building. It has to do with the predominant interest in the art of France, Germany, Italy, you know, America, and the art centers and where they were located. But, you know, one can at least say that with the 20th century infatuation with landscape painting, and particularly Impressionism, the door opened a little bit to Danish landscape painting, the so-called Danish Golden Age, which is the 19th century. So I think some of you probably are more familiar with that, have seen museum exhibitions even recently at the Metropolitan Museum, for example. But I don't think most of us really know very much or recognize much about the figural tradition in the 19th century. And then we have Hammershøi, and that's what he is. He's a figural painting, but then also, strangely, he becomes a specialist of paintings that don't have anything in them, purportedly empty rooms. So we're going to get to that in a second. So, you know, who was this fella? Who was Wilhelm Hammershøi? Well, that's him to the right in this photograph. That's his wife in the middle, Ida, who becomes his frequent model. And that's one of his best supporters and collectors, whose name was Madsen on the left. So sometimes it helps to put things into perspective right away if we start at the end. So, he died when he was but 52 from throat cancer on February 13th, 1916. And that's just 2 years after his beloved mother, with whom he continued to live as an adult until his marriage to Ida. And Ida was actually the sister of one of his artist friends with whom he attended the Art Academy in Copenhagen. And in the roughly 3 decades of his career, which began around 1885 when he was just 21 years old, and he submitted a painting that was eventually refused by academic jurors because it was too particularly strange. But at that time, during his career, all of this is what's happening. And I'm just showing you one of our old favorites here, this little nugget of ours in terms of Impressionism, Claude Monet. So this is what's been going on. This is what's been going on, and we've all lived with Vincent for quite some time. You remember our recent exhibition and this very famous painting, purportedly one of his last, although now we know it's not the last, but a very famous image indeed. And this was also going on, and I'm showing you this just as a reminder because all of this is so resplendently colorful, right? I mean, all of this painting and all of it's very familiar now to you as part of the canon. And now, of course, this was going on as well. And, this is Gauguin. And Gauguin had just left for Tahiti when, Hammershøi is coming to the fore. And that's where he would develop his own strange language of this quote-unquote primitive, mysterious, pseudo-religious type of imagery. But, this is what Hammershøi chose to do. So it's quite distinct, isn't it? So it's not like he didn't know about all of this other incredible innovation happening in the avant-garde, especially in Paris, but this is what his specialization was. And it never wavered, his art. He chose as his subject mostly domestic interiors, always set in relatively spare, minimally decorated rooms. As most famous and now considered the most powerfully enigmatic are the interiors he did that are entirely devoid of people. Here, for example, is the first painting he did of an empty room. This is the image on the left, and it's from 1888. And here on the right is what is considered to be one of the last pictures he ever made, and it's dated 1914, some 26 years later. We'll get to the formal characteristics of his manner of painting in due course, but I think we can see right away that this was an artist with a singularity of purpose. His intent from his early maturity to the very end of his career remained the same. The representation of interior psychological states conveyed through the careful, even obsessive description of domestic interiors, more often the rooms of the 2 Copenhagen apartments in which he lived with his lifelong partner, Ida. Hammershøi's focus on the everyday rooms that he inhabited does parallel the subject matter chosen by the 2 French artists most frequently described as intimistes, the so-called nabis, Édouard Vuillard and Pierre Bonnard. And incidentally, in case you were wondering where our Bonnard went, because I had to deinstall it, it got lent to a great big show at the Kimball Art Museum, which I hope you can go and see. I hope I can go and see too. And it's getting some really good airplay. So here I'm showing you a very well-known example of the kind of subjects favored by Vuillard, especially in the 1890s. And this is pretty typical of the type of these are very small pictures that he did, usually on artist's board, and frequently his mother and his sister in these kind of claustrophobic interior settings. We know that Vuillard and Bonnard both used photography as a departure point for these often hallucinatory images of vibrating pattern, something that might seem counterintuitive given the overt distortions Vuillard employed. And I think you can see that quite clearly. I mean, it's hard to believe that the photograph really had anything to do with this strangely claustrophobic, overly patterned interior in which his sister seems to be mysteriously emerging from the wallpaper itself. And yet this is another point of commonality between Vuillard and Hammershøi. We know that Hammershøi also sometimes derived inspiration from photography to inform his paintings, as in this painting that you can see, this interior with woman at piano. That's likely Ida again. And it's probably related to this photograph that he did of his sister Anna at the piano in a similar pose. And then you see that big painting over top of the piano. That's actually this painting that Hammershøi did of his sister Anna. And this was one of his very early masterpieces. But of course, the use of photography is not something unique to Vuillard, and it was often a strategy deployed by artists typically described as symbolist. You know, it's a denomination often ascribed to Hammershøi as well. You know, for example, this is a great painting by the Belgian artist Fernand Knopf. It's called Memories of Lawn Tennis. And you can see that he used photography as a way of pasting together his figural compositions, which therefore have a disjointed quality to them, as if hallucinated in a dream. The peculiar effect of distancing that occurs because of the specific signifying properties of these early gelatin silver prints is harnessed by these painters to create precisely the eerie sensation of a moment frozen for all eternity, which is essentially what early photography was, an instant memento mori, a vanitas. The disembodied quality of vision as expressed by the mechanically reproduced image of the photograph, especially in black and white, lends paintings of this era a new means of expressing emotional absence, an inaccessibility that creates a sense of mystery. And indeed, symbolism in general frequently took as its subject the representation of nuanced psychological states, often tinged by melancholy and loss. You know, it's not difficult to see why Hammershøi should have been perceived as sympathetic to symbolism as practiced by some of its most recognizable exponents. Something similar happened in the critical reception of Vincent van Gogh, for example, another artist embraced by symbolist critics, even though he himself never identified with any specific group. The same is true of Hammershøi, who early on impressed influential critics like Théodore Duret, for example, and whose work was exhibited in the major urban art centers of Europe. Like the most significant and original artists of his generation, Hammershøi was perceived in his lifetime as a natural fit with the prevailing aesthetics of international symbolism. Although he himself never identified with any single avant-garde group, his appreciation and awareness of other artists, often categorized as part of this movement, becomes evident once we recognize their shared sensibilities. For example, this is Hammershøi's ambitiously outsized canvas, huge, as you see from the dimensions, and it's called Artemis. And you can see how in some ways it's a reply to something like this. This is by the French symbolist Puvis de Chavannes, his Young Women by the Sea, in which a vaguely mythological narrative is imbued with a nostalgic heaviness, as if mourning a now irretrievable classical past. And this is actually one of the studies that fed into Hammershøi's composition, Artemis. Or, for example, in the same spirit as the Swiss symbolist Ferdinand Hodler, whose large-scale allegorical works exude a similarly disturbing sense of melancholic loss. Hammershøi traveled frequently to urban centers of the European avant-garde, Paris, London, Berlin, Munich, as well as to see the old masters that he revered in Italy and closer to home in the major museums throughout Scandinavia. He was certainly aware of Puvis, as well as the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, though the latter's experiments in strident color did not interest him. Another often cited example of Hammershøi's early masterpieces, again, they were considered, is this astonishingly strange image called Five Portraits. And it's his version of basically the artist group portrait associated with Fontaine-Latour. And you can see, I think, that readily. And Hammershøi would have seen Fontaine-Latour's painting at the Universal Exposition of 1889, which he attended. But Hammershøi's strangely disjointed depiction of his closest artist friends bears an even stronger resemblance to a similarly monochromatic and stark group portrait by the Swiss colleague of the Nabi group, Félix Vallotton. So here you can see the Vallotton, and here you could see how closely they seem to relate. And it's even possible that Vallotton was using Hammershøi's group portrait as inspiration for his own. Hammershøi's manner of painting also has its resonance with artists practicing contemporaneously, although he said very little about contemporary art, except to proclaim his dedication to the art of the past. The one living artist that Hammershøi spoke about admiringly in his correspondence and journal entries was James Whistler. This painting by Hammershøi of his mother is an overt homage, which I think you can see readily. And we know that Hammershøi even traveled to London to try and meet Whistler, whose celebrated masterpiece dated to 1874 and was acquired by the French state in 1891. But Hammershøi was turned away at the door and told the master was not at home, and he never tried to meet him again. Of course, not only the choice to isolate the figure in profile turned deliberately away from us, but the mostly monochromatic palette shows Hammershøi's indebtedness to his kindred spirit, Whistler. The sense of detachment, interior remove, especially when the sitter is apparently doing nothing, certainly strikes us right away. Or is reflection or reverie an action? More on this in a moment. The convention of depicting figures as though entirely unaware of our prying gaze, as though fully absorbed in some everyday task, is of course not one that Hammershøi invented. Here he looked to the Dutch and Flemish tradition of genre painting, or the representation of everyday life, perhaps most famously associated with the 17th century Dutch painter Johannes Vermeer. And this is his famous milkmaid. In fact, Hammershøi is often labeled the Danish Vermeer precisely because of the uncanny ability he had to so faithfully represent the ordinary and the familiar. They were both painters of light, painters of solitude, and frequently painters of silence. However, there's an undeniable difference between the golden light of Vermeer's interiors and the cheerful sense of industrious purpose with which such servants go about their daily tasks. The mesmerizing detail of Vermeer's meticulously described surfaces radiate with health, cleanliness, and prosperity, as in this gorgeous canvas. While not overtly moralizing, Vermeer's interiors nevertheless still function as allegories of the kind of orderly Protestant household that is the reward of living well and according to God's will. How different, then, are Hammershøi's isolated women, whether his mother, his sister Anna, or his wife Ida. And this is his young girl sewing from 1887. The young girl sewing bows her head and looks intently at the fine needlework in her hands. The artist gives us no access to the eventual product of her labor, setting her against an anonymous blank wall. We know nothing of her status. Is she a servant, a family member, a hired model perhaps, or a complete stranger he's observed somewhere else? Her sober, high-necked black bodice creates a strong silhouette, and yet the solidly legible body gives nothing away of the young girl's interior life. Is she almost dozing off, bored by her repetitive task? Is she daydreaming of people and things that we can't know? Or is she simply concentrating so that her mind has become unaware even of its own meanderings? Though Hammershøi's written correspondence leaves little detail as to the art of the past that he most admired, we know that he preferred to visit the Louvre when he was in Paris or in any of the other major European art centers that he visited, which included, as I said, London, Munich, Berlin, The Hague, and of course the great museums of Italy. He faithfully attended the major museums, but it seems probable that he was aware of the 18th century master of this kind of contemplative genre painting, Jean-Siméon Chardin. And I'm showing you a gorgeous but tiny canvas here, right? One of a pendant pair, and it's now in the collection of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Chardin was beloved precisely because he knew how to drain such 17th century northern subjects of the servant class of any easy moralizing message, lending these isolated figures a sense of psychological complexity to which we readily respond. Our kitchen maid slumps forward, holding the knife she should be using to scrape the turnip that dangles carelessly from the fingertips of her other hand. Chardin was a master of capturing these extended moments of reverie, which we readily recognize as a natural part of such chores. A moment's pause from the task at hand becomes an unrecorded durational gap in our consciousness when we find the mind disassociated from the body and lost in reflection, whether through the interference of memory or the perturbations of the spirit that can make us lose control of our wayward thoughts. The tension of such depictions of sustained, attentive inattentiveness, and this really was one of Chardin's niche specializations, is the reigning preoccupation of so much of Hammershøi's oeuvre. And his manner of communicating the idea of an inner life relied heavily on a studied contrast between legibility and inaccessibility, between sharp contrasts of graspable form combined with a hazy indistinctness that again recalls the painterly softness of vision that was Chardin's specialty. Look, for example, at this simple kitchen still life, in which the slow drag of the brush is recorded in the very texture of the painting's rough surface. Chardin, like Hammershøi, was presumed to be a slow painter, laborious even, not unlike his unlikely Dutch predecessor, Rembrandt, with whom he was frequently compared in this regard. Hammershøi's brushwork, painstakingly applied, retains a similar intimation of slowness and deliberation, something that was registered most eloquently by one of his most ardent admirers, the Austrian poet and sometimes art critic Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke once observed, "Hammershøi is not one of those about whom one must speak quickly. His work is long and slow, and at whichever moment one apprehends it, it will offer plentiful reasons to speak of what is important and essential in art." Rilke intended to write a monograph on our artist, but somehow was unable to find the words to translate the visual poetry of the Danish artist's eloquently silent canvases. The other parallels that spring to mind are anachronistic, admittedly, in that they come from later modernism, even American modernism. For example, isolated figures, often women, again, caught in a moment of some familiar everyday task, were the purview of that drama of light and shadow that was the domain of Edward Hopper. This is a painting from the Whitney Museum, and in here we see, it's dated to 1921, 5 years after Hammershøi's death. It has something of the same qualities, a labored, slow brushwork, areas of illumination in pitch black darkness, and a similar sense of provocation to our gaze, which the painting both invites and simultaneously repels. The rectangular form of the canvas is highlighted by the use of the centralized door to enframe the figure, whose glistening bare shoulders, caught at the precise angle of greatest tension as her fingers pull the thread tight, are presented to us, even while her face remains entirely unavailable, and hence her identity and thoughts remain teasingly, tantalizingly, entirely her own. The device of picturing figures from the back, often designated in art history by the German term Rückenfigur, is something we'll return to in the minutes to follow. Suffice it to say that this becomes one of Hammershøi's favorite strategies, and one that he employed over and over again in his depictions of the solitary Ida in the sparingly decorated rooms of their Copenhagen apartments. So here I'm just going to show you examples of Ida, his constant muse, and shown from the back. Hammershøi's compositions, which are like Bach fugues, often variations on a theme, He made 70 such domestic interiors, of which around half feature the solitary figure of Ida. This obsessive repetition calls to mind another somewhat anachronistic comparison in the later 20th century, and that would be to Morandi. And if you know Morandi's art, it's incredibly repetitive. Here's just two examples, and you can see he just keeps on rearranging the same configuration of still life objects over and over again in slightly different palette. But this endless recycling of still life arrangements featuring an array of glass and ceramic vessels has much of the same infinite variety as Hammershøi's interiors. A similarly dry, deliberate, textured surface applied, again, with seemingly endless variety, characterizes Morandi's diminutive canvases. I'm not the first to draw this comparison, though I have no idea, factually, if Morandi actually knew Hammershøi's work, although it's quite likely he could have, since Hammershøi, his critical reputation, it's been revived in the last 30 years, but Hammershøi did actually spend a lot of time in Italy, so it's possible. Look again at the elements that make up Hammershøi's interiors. Let me just the geometry of the moldings on the wall and the ever-present door, whether open or closed, the light streaming from an oblique window or one that is glimpsed through an open door in a room beyond the one in which Ida is seated, the punctuation of the interior walls by either mirrors or framed pictures in an endless variation of effects produced by the kind of light dictated by the time of day and the seasons. This was Hammershøi's universe. But what, if anything, is happening in such enigmatic compositions? What was Hammershøi attempting to convey in these actionless vignettes of everyday married life? One scholar has written eloquently about the common thematics of the ideas explored by the brilliant philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, whose work Hammershøi definitely knew. He owned copies of his major books. I'm referring to an essay published by the Princeton art historian Bridget Alstorff in Critical Inquiry back in 2016. In Kierkegaard's set piece Either Or, he explores the dual points of view on married life, ultimately privileging the notion of an aesthetic born of predictable habit and intimate familiarity that defines the cocoon of married life, as opposed to a condemnation of marriage as dull and bereft of sensual desire, precisely because of overfamiliarity. Alstorff writes beautifully about the delicacy of Hammershøi's communication of the ever-mysterious Ida. Just the nape of her neck is often the only part of her flesh that's offered to us, but its vulnerability to the gaze is just enough to hint at the warmth of the touch that it invites, as in this masterpiece of the Rückenfigur, as if to subtly hint at Ida's restrained but pure erotic availability to Hammershøi's gaze. He places a ceramic dish on the table to her right, its scalloped, blossoming curves recalling the attributes of Botticelli's Venus, and its startling whiteness contrasting flatteringly with the pearlescent quality of Ida's bare neck. Look, too, at the subtle play of light that Hammershøi so expertly captures with each infinitesimal variation of brushstroke, so that the wall, rather than a monotonous, undifferentiated field, takes on a life of its own, replete with minute observations of the specificity of embodied perception, especially when concentrated by the attentive gaze of the artist. The use of the Rückenfigur plays upon a peculiar sense of doubleness that is inherent to our sudden consciousness of our own backside, recollecting to us our inability to actually see ourselves from behind, except through an internalized visualization based upon our felt awareness of our own bodies in space. Referred to as autoscopy, which is the phenomenon of perceiving oneself from outside one's own body, the Rückenfigur is normally associated with the earlier German Romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich. Like Hammershøi, Friedrich often used his own dear wife as his model, as is the case in this famous painting from 1822 called Woman at a Window, which is in the National State Museum in Berlin. As explored in the now classic account of Friedrich's Rückenfigur by the celebrated Harvard art historian Joseph Kerner, Friedrich accomplished his version of the sublime through these kinds of compositions that played upon what the figure in the painting can see, the imaginary participation we feel by our inhabitation of the provided viewing position, which at the same time instantly recollects the precipice of time that separates the unique moment in historical time and our own. In other words, for Friedrich, the Rückenfigur accomplished the ideals of the Romantic symbol, in which the very experience of the represented image immediately raises our awareness of the inevitable belatedness of all embodied experience. As soon as we reflect upon it and represent it, the moment has vanished. I've called Hammershøi's peculiarly inward version of the Friedrichian sublime, which I'm illustrating here through two very famous examples, a kind of interior sublime. For if Friedrich was able to accomplish the vertiginous sensation of the oscillation in our aesthetic experience between what was then and what is now, between what Friedrich saw and felt and what the painting now occasions us to feel, and their very inextricability in aesthetic experience, to me, Hammershøi accomplishes something of the same effect, if almost through antithetical means. It isn't the overpowering sense of Edmund Burke's version of the sublime, which I'm illustrating here through a painting by Claude Vernet from the Dallas Museum of Art, with its emphasis on the spatial magnitude of nature that overwhelms, or the indistinctness of the fog that prevents the mind from ever mentally grasping the expanse of space suggested by it. The device of the Rückenfigur, as Kerner usefully summarizes in his book, is a long one, and it's one that was even included in Renaissance religious altarpieces, and I'm showing you here a very famous one from the Louvre by the 15th century Flemish master Jan van Eyck. It's called the Madonna of Chancellor Rollin, who was the commissioner of the piece, and it's dated to 1435. If you look very closely at the near center of the composition, there are two small figures seen from behind, gazing at the view of the river into the far distance. Symbolically, these kinds of figures offer the viewer an imaginative substitute by which to enter into the paintings, to experience the sense of nature's majesty through the view of seemingly limitless space, and at the near center of the composition's illusion of exaggerated depth, is to feel the eternal timelessness of this sacred moment, a moment that has transcended historical time. And yet the incredible particularization of this tour de force of illusionism, its seductive description of lavish textiles, ornate stone floors, dimpled flesh, all of this overwhelming realism leads us to feel as though we ourselves are participating in this holy revelation. The use of painting's powers of illusionistic seduction to claim the hearts and minds of the faithful has a very long and distinguished history, and I'm giving you here just two of my favorite examples by the great 17th century Baroque master Diego Velázquez. Again, it's the foregrounded elements of the familiar kitchen still life and the ordinary people so prominently depicted to the left in this very wide composition that brings the biblical event to highlight through a window in the upper right that beguilingly connects the sacred episode and its import to the here and now. Velázquez was unparalleled in his ability to conjure through paint, and with such veracity, the specific properties of the most common objects, as in this very brilliant composition. But precisely because the objects are simple, we respond to them immediately. The way that light is used to artfully distinguish their texture and weight performs a kind of magic that instantly erases the temporal distance between the artist's 17th century existence and our own, his perceptual record and of these very objects and their revivification through our gaze upon this painted representation. The signifying mechanisms of still life and genre painting or the representation of the everyday are, to my mind, the key to Hammershøi's brilliant artistic project. As Bridget Alsdorf has put it, Hammershøi's art achieves the Kierkegaardian convergence of the instant and a consciousness of eternity. Just how he accomplishes this is perhaps best exemplified by the brilliantly conceived empty interiors with which we started. Perhaps the most famous of these is this painting, which is dated to 1900, and which is known as Dust Motes Dancing in the Sunbeams. And again, there's actually no action, no subject to this empty room, which nevertheless resonates with a universality of familiar experience in which we are immediately absorbed. Who among us has not, at one time or another, noticed the way that the sunlight can transform the invisible into the visible, with the dust motes gently materializing the movement of the air that we breathe, but so often cannot see? This most mundane of perceptions suddenly takes on the metaphorical weight of our eternal belatedness in a painting like this, in which a secular space has all of the gravity of the Christian Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, in spite of depicting nothing but the ringing absence of a room in which we imagine we hear maybe the muffled memories of its former inhabitants. The image is tinged with melancholy, even as the warmth of the sunlight literally animates the particulate matter that in fact populates this empty space with its cool, otherwise barren sense of absence. Now we are afforded the view of the place that the Rückenfigur might see, though the regard of the window through which the building opposite stops our gaze, giving us only the multiple panes that filter the light, which again is made material, this time through the shadows cast by the window panes on the floor. In many ways, as it was for Vermeer, it is the light, in this case the Danish light of Copenhagen, that is the subject of Hammershøi's interiors. The sunlight is filtered through unseen panes of glass or ordered by the limbs of buildings external to the one in which we are in, as in this cascade of lit parallelograms that is both a portrait of Hammershøi's studio, the room in which he was standing, and the outward image that is hidden from us on the easel with its spindly legs. The degree of self-reference is hardly accidental and again speaks to Hammershøi's obsession with the intersection between what is there and what is not, the light that illuminates but only implies that which remains unseen. The shapes created by light and shadow in Hammershøi's interiors finds its equivalent in the words of Kierkegaard in his masterpiece Either Or. If I pick up a shadow graph, and this is an example of a shadow graph that I'm showing you, I have no impression of it, cannot arrive at an actual conception of it, only when I hold it up toward the wall and do not look at it directly, but at what appears on the wall. Only then do I see it. So it is also with the picture I want to show here, an interior picture that does not become perceptible until I see through the exterior. Perhaps there's nothing striking about the exterior, but when I look through it, only then do I discover the interior picture, which is what I want to show, an interior picture that is too delicate to be externally perceptible, since it is woven from the soul's faintest moods. And if you know Karen Kawaguchi, that's actually Karen. When just the other day she had brought in her little bat headdress, and she created a shadow graph, so I immediately seized upon it as an example. One feels, I think, the inadequacy of words before Hammershøi's silent interiors, which is perhaps why Rilke never felt up to the task of attempting to narrate his art. There is a remarkable consistency to Hammershøi's paintings. In fact, they have little of that sense of momentum and shifting in artistic direction that so often defines the twists and turns of an artist's career. To experience one of his interiors is to be reduced to much the same rigorous confining of one's attention to the objects of his world, no matter which interior, early or late, we are examining. For example, although repeated, the table and chair are positioned in such a way to orchestrate their reciprocity with the other objects in each room. Each canvas abounds with the specificity of touch that firmly embeds our understanding of the painting as a record over time through countless dabs of the brush. We cannot help but mimic this prolonged concentration on the part of the artist, even as we study each object to divine some hint as to its user or maker, some story that yet refuses to be told. And yet one hears the stillness of Hammershøi's interior, just as a ticking of a clock draws attention to a pervasive silence through its hushed constancy. For what is stillness but the absence of sound? And how can it be perceived without the anticipation of what came before and after? While Hammershøi's interiors remain the best-known works that he produced, he did in fact treat other subjects, including architectural exteriors, like this one. And, again, it's pictured at a very eccentric angle that resists as much as it invites our desire to see into the building. And this, too, was based on a photograph. I think you can see something of the same in this architectural view of Anneliseborg Square from 1896. We have the same in and out of focused attention that has all of the particularity of sharp detail of a photograph, yet at the same time gives way to an abstracted suggestion of shapes and an indistinctness of vision, very like what we find in the interiors. With not a soul in sight, these buildings have the unchanging airlessness of a mausoleum, their monochrome palette refusing to read as though bound to one time of day or even a particular season. Hammershøi also painted more conspicuously decorative and lavish interiors, such as the Great Hall in Lindegarten. The absence of strong light, save for the gleam visible at the top of the partially ajar door at the center of the composition, gives the room even more of a sense of twilight, the twilight of an age of opulence now long abandoned, but still preserved. Again, Hammershøi's modernity seems uncanny, especially when we compare this painting to the work of a contemporary German photographer named Candida Hofer, and this is from her own collection, who chose as her form of typology the empty rooms of museums like the Louvre, formerly the exclusive apartments of kings and queens. Coming full circle, the infinite mirror of repeated windows and an opening at its point of procession that glows but seems to recede from us indefinitely has the same simultaneity of the then and now of Hammershøi's painted rooms. The photograph stills and concentrates our attention through the particularities that only a camera can capture, while the photographer forces our vertiginous relationship to the moment she recorded and the one in which we now experience the image. This telescoping of time and the glimpsed perception of the image's indifference to our passing is, in essence, relatable to the interior sublime of Hammershøi's painted interiors. The Rückenfigur and such empty interiors of historical buildings lives on in contemporary photography, reigniting our recognition of the unique and prescient sensibility of Wilhelm Hammershøi, the painter of silence, the painter of the interior sublime. Thank you very much for your attention. I did it in 45 minutes. And I had a couple more slides to show you just because this also, which I think many of you know, the Richter, it's so interesting to me, again, how Hammershøi seems to really anticipate a lot of these devices that have become such a big part of the vocabulary of contemporary art. So he definitely is someone who innovated, I think in some ways unwittingly, in a way that, same with Vincent van Gogh to a certain extent. There's a certain amount of brilliant prescience that just comes of a single-mindedness of purpose. And often that kind of single-mindedness doesn't seem to mesh with anything else that's going on around it in the contemporary scene. And I just think it's really interesting how much of what he produced, it reminds me of Vincent, even though it's completely different, what he does and how he does it, but the same intensity and deliberate purpose, this sort of almost suffocating sense of his intention where you really can't get away from it. It's very imposing. And I think that's why in the 20th century and now the 21st century, Hammershøi suddenly become so, I think, popular now with the public because they really do recognize this current of modernity that becomes such a part of our everyday experience of the moment and of the past and our relationship to the past. And this sense, again, of melancholy longing for a type of life, a type of time that we no longer experience. And, I was just saying to Amada, our new director who's sitting right here, that, I think it's really hard for us to even recollect what silence sounds like, if that's a way of expressing it. And that really is what Hammershøi's project is about. And that's why I felt like I even had to read, which I normally don't do, because his images are so incredibly complex that to translate them into words becomes necessary to be able to feel the complexity of the surface, which I can't give you in a digital image. So I have to use language to try and approximate a little bit of the intensity of what it is he's put into every single one of these paintings. So, you'll forgive me if I kind of droned on there for a while, but his art is definitely one that transcends language, and that, I think, is the sign of true genius. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Bob?
I missed some of the dates. Was there a point at which you stopped drawing figures completely and just did rooms?
He kind of oscillates between doing empty rooms and doing rooms that have a single figure, usually just one figure, sometimes two figures, but usually it's just the one figure, and almost 9 times out of 10, it's Ida. So, you can see why somebody like Bridget Alstorff would make a lot of hay out of that. His desire to focus so much on his own inward reality in his own cocooned life with Ida in the state of marriage. Yeah, he knows, though, that he hit on something. And I was going to do this and I forgot, but that we have this great painting by Walter Gay of an interior. You remember this, Bob. I had it on view in the small format American painting show. And Walter Gay, who was practicing in Pittsburgh, American artist who specialized in interiors. But his are exactly the opposite. They're replete with every gewgaw, decorative surface, marble, velvet, and the whole Victorian ideal of luxury. And Hammershøi is exactly the opposite. And, some of this can be accounted for just by the taste of the Danes, because they never really went in for the Victorian, sort of lavish claptrap sort of thing, and they liked a spare aesthetic. But a lot of it is just him. It's just Hammershøi, his love of this very kind of spare, silent room where the moldings become largely, the most defining graphical element, that and the light and the cast shadows of light. And again, it's remarkable too. He's an artist who really doesn't change all that much. You can see some variation in the brush work. The palette remains remarkably monochromatic. Otherwise, there's just not a lot of shifting that goes on.
What about the arid elements? It feels a touch Asperger's from the sense of precision and the distance. But there are like shadows where they shouldn't be, and there are shadows where there shouldn't be, and there aren't shadows where there should be. Always just like a couple of elements in each one. And is he doing that to make someone look, or trying to not make it perfect, or?
That's a good question. I think you can, you can interpret that, I think, in many different ways, but I do think he does it very deliberately, and often people have pointed out that there's sort of a surreal quality, again, very anticipatory of that kind of surrealist airlessness that you'll find in Curator. But yeah, he sometimes will represent a very familiar, like a piano that suddenly doesn't have 4 legs. And, you do notice it. It takes you a while, but then you do notice it. So, I mean, I do think in some ways he's playing upon the notion that your perception of everything is filtered through your remembered understanding of that same object that you've been living with for the last 20 years. You get that sense of how every condensed moment of time is somehow concentrated in that one object, whether it's a teacup or a piece of furniture. So the deletion is just the way that your own attention is, right? Sometimes you're very aware of the two table legs, and sometimes they're not a part of your visual understanding of that object at all. And it's something of the same quality you have, and I hope you are now feeling this when I talk about the Rückenfigur. The Rückenfigur, I've been saying Rückenfigur, it's a very fun word to say. But, the sensation that you have of your own backside, right? I mean, it's a very weird thing once you're conscious of your own body in this regard and you're aware of the doubleness of things. And then you see yourself from the outside, which is, again, I think a phenomenon that is very interesting to him and that he's trying to evoke somehow through his imagery.
Curious about the reception of his work by contemporaries or at the time.
So again, kind of like Vincent, especially towards the end of his career, Hammershøi was really well received. I mean, there were people who just thought he was the cat's meow from almost the beginning of his career. So even though, the official academic jurors went like, what in the hell are you trying to do? Everybody else was like, this is something. This is really, and Theodor Duret goes out of his way to go and visit him. Rilke actually spends time with him, and completely blown away by his art. So, the unfortunate thing is that he died really pretty young. But is anybody here a dentist in the audience by chance? Because I was just gonna say, you could be like this one dentist and just strike it rich because he bought 57 paintings by Hammershøi because he was so in love with him, which is how they all ended up in the Copenhagen State Museum. But, he inspired this incredible devotion among certain people who I think recognized just how special he was. And he was written about as being the most innovative Danish painter like ever, basically, because he really was. He was incredibly, to use a hackneyed word, he was really original in what he did. Anybody else? Question? Yes, in the back?
Why do you think that the onlooker is so mesmerized by the paintings?
I think that's a question that's best answered by the experience of the paintings themselves. We don't have one of these paintings in our collection, but there are many American museums that do have these paintings. And I would really encourage you, because again, these slides are totally inadequate to the task of communicating the actual phenomenon, the sensation of touch, all of the complexity of the surface that is a part of his canvas. And you kind of need that direct experience to be able to understand why they're so moving. I think maybe you're more familiar with Vermeer, right? Like Vermeer too, you look at a slide, compared to the real painting, it doesn't do anything. It's the phenomenon of that aesthetic experience, so specific to that unique object, that pulls you in and completely absorbs you in the experience of looking even without you realizing it. That is the pull and the power of the painting itself. And that's basically the way that I figure out whether or not a painting is good. Then you should try it. If it pulls you and it holds you, it's good. It's just as basic as all that. And with Hammershøi, that's one of the reasons that I fell in love with him immediately. And, again, you're not supposed to have favorites, but, terrible secret revealed as I have favorites. I just don't talk about it very often. And Chardin's always been one of my favorite painters. As soon as I saw Hammershøi, because I did an exhibition that included a lot of his work when I was at the Walters, I totally fell in love with him because he has a lot of the same characteristics. And again, it's that understanding of how to fully absorb your attention, and usually through the most ordinary of subject matters, just the everyday. But it's that sense of universality that is harnessed by the image and through its translation in paint in this way that is so specific and unique. And again, this is why Hammershøi is so strangely modern, because his surfaces are so declamatory of being made at the same time, right? They're very much fabricated by him. So you can feel his sensibility, even as you have the illusion that you're seeing what you've seen a million times before. And now it's being distilled for you by this one painting. Let me put it this way. It's very hard to metaphorize this whole sensation, but do you remember when you were a child and you realized for the first time that you could not retain all of the information of your perceptual experience in the world? I remember being driven by my father in the backseat of a tiny sports car and looking up at the trees. And they were passing by, and I realized I wanted to still this moment, and that I had to demarcate that moment by remembering to think about the moment. And as soon as I remembered to think about the moment, it had vanished. And I had this really weird sensation of a complete loss of control. And I realized that you have no control over time. But the only thing you can do is to try and fix it and register it somehow through some kind of mnemonic device. That's a little bit, I think, of what his project is, if that's any kind of an answer. And again, the inadequacy of my words to his accomplishment is too painful. Anybody else have any questions that I can't answer? Yes, Bob.
To the extent that Hammershøi was a very important Danish artist of his time, to what extent did he influence and create followers who represented and understood what he was trying to accomplish, and what happened after him in terms of either others that formed a sympathetic sort of painting to that look, or an evolution towards a more modern style of painting that supplanted Impressionism?
Yeah, that's part of the reason that he went into critical neglect. You just hit it on the head. So even though he was very successful during his lifetime, by the time he dies, the whole art world has moved on so rapidly to so many other things that have nothing to do with what he was trying to do. And basically, figural representation, representational painting takes a total nosedive, right? So we're already into the realm of pure abstraction before you know it. So again, he goes through this real gulf of critical obscurity after he dies. And really, I got to say, this Robert Rosenblum, again, if you know Robert Rosenblum's work, he was really genius in this regard, is he would look back at the history of art, even the recent past, and he would find and excavate those artists and bring them back into your consciousness. So when they did this giant retrospective of Hammershøi at the Guggenheim, everyone was blown away. Like, who is this Danish guy? I mean, this is crazy. How did he know how to paint like this? And it seemed so anachronistic and so odd. But then all of a sudden, people fell in love with him. And to this day, I think, you can see it reflected in the rising prices associated with his works at auction. I mean, he's become one of the kind of early modernist heroes. And again, it's funny how that happens with the critical reception. He seemed to be completely forgotten, and then all of a sudden, voila, there he is again. And people are just like, wow, blown away. And this whole comparison to Vermeer, if he'd heard that during his lifetime, I'm sure he would have been extremely pleased. But, it's ironic because he dies very shortly after his mother dies. So he really has a very brief career in some ways, and it's sort of sad. One wonders. Although, again, I think he probably would have kept on painting in exactly the same way for another 20 years, and by then he really would have been completely out of fashion, But I just don't think he cared. It was like, this is what I do, and this is the way I'm going to do it. So, but thank God for that, because there's nobody else like Hammershøi. And, we talked a little bit about Peter Ilsted, his longtime best friend, quote unquote, and his brother-in-law, who also did these empty interiors. His somehow don't have quite the same gravity. I don't know what it is. He's a brilliant printmaker. There's a very famous portrait that he does of Hammershøi. It's gorgeous, and he has this great attentiveness, the same sort of intensity, but somehow his painted interiors don't really have the same depth and resonance as Hammershøi's, and he's not terribly well known except for specialists like Bob who knows his work. So yeah, Hammershøi is definitely a unique sensibility, and in some ways he has no followers, except weirdly for somebody like Morandi, and I would love to look into whether or not Morandi did know his work and what he thought. There's something about, and anybody have a Morandi? We also don't have a Morandi in the collection, so I'm always open, so look me up. But with that, I'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening, but thank you so much for your attention. And next month, I should have mentioned we're having a Japanese painting specialist from the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. So, hopefully you'll come and see Matthew Welch, who's going to be talking, I think, about ukiyo-e, among other things. But he's fabulous, and he's also much more entertaining and funny than I am. So, okay, have a good evening.